There's a moment in every investigation when you stop looking for the truth, and the truth starts looking for you. I didn't realize it at the time, but someone had already noticed me, watching. Some truths attract attention. They didn't want me silenced. They wanted to see what I would do next. That thought stayed with me as the highway stretched forward beneath the pale, undecided light of early morning. The sky looked unfinished, like it was waiting for instructions. Gas stations flicked their signs on one by one. People moved with the quiet confidence of routine, coffee cups in hand, radios murmuring the same news they heard every day. I felt like I was moving through that world under a borrowed name. I didn't answer the messages, not because I didn't want to, but because answering felt like consent. Consent doesn't always look like agreement. Sometimes it looks like acknowledging the question exists. So instead, I drove. The coordinates were folded on the passenger seat, written in my own handwriting. I kept glancing at them, bothered by the fact that I'd written them down without thinking. That small action felt like the first betrayal. Proof that some part of me had already accepted the rules of a game I didn't remember agreeing to play. Every few miles I imagined the system recalculating, not reacting, not rushing, just adjusting. That idea unsettled me more than pursuit ever could. Chases are loud, they announce danger, adjustment is quiet, it assumes time is on its side. I kept returning to the word released. Release isn't freedom, it's permission with conditions. You release something when you expect it to return, or when you're confident you know exactly how to retrieve it. The thought sat heavy in my chest as I pulled off the highway for coffee, more out of habit than hunger. The place was already busy. A woman laughed too loudly at something her friend said. Someone argued gently with a barista about milk preferences. Life continuing. The cashier smiled at me, asked how my morning was going. Her voice was warm, automatic, well-practiced. Fine, I said, because that's what people say when they don't want to explain themselves. The receipt printed and slid across the counter. I took it without thinking. Then I looked down. The date was wrong. Yesterday's date, just one day off. Small, easy to dismiss. The kind of error you notice and then immediately forgive because correcting it would take effort, and effort would mean admitting it mattered. I stood there a second too long, staring at the numbers. The cashier didn't notice. The line behind me shifted, impatient. I told myself it was a glitch, a system update that hadn't finished rolling out, a tired employee who forgot to reset something. All reasonable explanations. And yet the unease settled anyway. Not loud, not dramatic, precise. Back in the car, my phone buzzed. No message, just a notification from an app I hadn't opened in years. One I barely remembered downloading. Location services re-enabled. I frowned and opened the settings, turned them off again, watched the icon disappear. 2 minutes later, it was back. That was when I understood the first rule of this phase. This wasn't about control, it was about visibility. They weren't forcing my hand, they were watching how often I checked it. I drove another hour before stopping again, this time at a rest area just off the road. Families moved around me without noticing. A child dropped a toy and cried. A parent knelt to pick it up. Someone's dog barked once, sharp and brief. Ordinary sounds, ordinary lives. I sat in the car with the engine off, watching my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked the same. That disturbed me more than if I hadn't. I thought about my father then, about the note he'd written in his careful, urgent handwriting. This ends tonight. Had he known this moment would come? Had he understood that once I responded to the past, the present would begin testing me, not with danger, but with options? My phone vibrated again. Unknown sender. You don't need to be careful. The sentence chilled me more than a threat ever could. Careful implies danger you can avoid. This implied inevitability. I imagined someone watching a screen, waiting to see whether my pulse changed, whether my breathing shifted, whether my hands hesitated before I made the next decision. I didn't reply. I started the engine. As I merged back onto the highway, I became acutely aware of how much data a single drive could generate. Speed, direction, stops, hesitation, patterns disguised as freedom. I wondered how long I'd been predictable. The radio came on without me touching it, static at first, then music, a song I didn't recognize, playing softly, almost apologetically. I turned it off. Silence returned, thicker now. I thought about my mother, about her warnings, about the way she'd said time was running out without explaining what it was running toward. I understood now. Time wasn't the threat. Response was. The system didn't need me to confess anything. It didn't need me to run. It didn't even need me to understand. It only needed to see how I moved once I knew I was being observed. That was the real test. And without meaning to, without realizing when the shift had happened, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not fear, focus. For the first time since this began, I wasn't asking what they wanted from me. I was asking what I could afford to give. The coordinates led me to a town that looked aggressively normal. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the streets, not the buildings, not even the people, but the intention behind how unremarkable it all was. Clean sidewalks, recently planted trees still held upright by thin wooden stakes, their leaves arranged like they'd been coached on how to appear healthy. Cafes with large windows and neutral interiors designed to feel welcoming without becoming memorable. A school near the center of town had a mural painted along its outer wall, animals smiling just enough to reassure parents, but not enough to excite children. Nothing about the place invited questions. That, I realized, was the invitation. I parked across the street from a low concrete building with tinted windows and no sign, no name, no logo, no hours posted on the door. It existed in the way certain buildings do, quietly, confidently, without explanation. Like it had never needed one. A building that didn't want to be remembered. I stayed in the car, not because I was afraid, because I wanted to see how the system handled hesitation. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. I watched the front entrance through the windshield, noting how little there was to note. No security guards, no cameras that announce themselves, no one lingering outside with the kind of posture that says they're waiting for something. People came and went naturally. A woman in a gray coat entered, with a laptop bag slung over her shoulder. A man followed a few minutes later carrying a cardboard box, the kind used for files or office supplies. Neither of them hurried, neither of them looked around. They moved the way people move when they believe the place they're entering belongs to them. My phone rested face down on my thigh. I didn't touch it. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Nothing happened. That absence felt deliberate. In the quiet of the parked car, I became acutely aware of my own timing. How often I checked the clock, how my breathing changed when nothing changed. It occurred to me then that waiting isn't neutral. It's information. The phone vibrated. Unknown sender. You can enter when you're ready. No threat, no countdown, no urgency, just permission. The message didn't feel like encouragement. It felt like documentation, like someone noting the moment a variable crossed a threshold. I didn't respond. I stayed where I was. If this was a test, I wanted to know what it measured. Another 5 minutes passed, then another. Nothing escalated. No follow-up message. No sign of impatience. The building across the street remained still, unbothered by my delay. That was when I understood. The system wasn't measuring courage. It was measuring compliance latency. How long I waited before doing what was expected. When I finally stepped out of the car, the air felt subtly different near the building. Not electric, just attentive, as if the space around it had learned how to listen and decided to practice. The door opened as I approached. No sound, no sensor chime, no mechanical click, just acceptance. Inside, the lobby was almost empty. White walls, abstract art that suggested emotion without committing to one, a reception desk with no one behind it, the surface clean enough to imply it was used regularly. I stopped just inside the door and waited. No one came. I became aware of how quiet my footsteps sounded on the polished floor, of how the lighting avoided shadows, of how carefully neutral everything felt, as if personality had been filtered out at the design stage. A door at the far end of the room slid open, again silently. I walked through, understanding too late that the test had never been whether I would enter. The test had been how long I would pretend I had a choice. The hallway beyond was short and unadorned. No signs, no labels, just a single door at the end, already ajar. I hesitated there, hand hovering near the handle, and felt a familiar tightening in my chest. This was the moment people usually talk about later, the point of no return. I stepped inside. The room wasn't what I expected. No restraints, no harsh lights, no obvious surveillance. Just a table, 2 chairs, a glass of water placed carefully within reach, condensation already forming on the outside. Someone had prepared for my comfort. That frightened me more than hostility ever could. I sat. The chair was positioned so the wall in front of me felt slightly too close, not claustrophobic, just aware, close enough to make posture matter, to make breathing noticeable, to make stillness feel observed even without proof. The door behind me remained open. That, I realized, was intentional. A screen embedded in the wall turned on slowly. Not a face, text. This interaction is observational. I exhaled quietly. Of course it is, I said, my voice sounding smaller in the controlled space. The text faded. New words appeared. No responses are required. Another lie. Everything here was a response. I thought about the caretaker at the abandoned facility, about how he described continuity as a seam so carefully hidden that most people never notice it exists. I wondered how many rooms like this one existed now, how many towns like this one, how many people were sitting in chairs, believing they were here for reasons that felt personal. The screen changed again. You may leave at any time. I waited. Nothing else appeared. No prompt, no instruction, no explanation. The silence stretched. That was the test. Not a question to answer, a pause to inhabit. I sat there longer than was comfortable, resisting the urge to fill the quiet with words, resisting the instinct to ask for clarification, resisting the reflex to make myself legible. Eventually I stood. The door didn't stop me. That was the most important data point of all. As I stepped back into the hallway, then into the lobby, I felt the subtle shift again, that sensation of being noted rather than followed. When I reached the front door, it opened for me just as smoothly as it had before. Outside, the town continued as if nothing had happened. A car passed, someone laughed nearby. The mural across the street glowed softly in the afternoon light. I stood there, uncertain for the first time, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I knew exactly what they were watching for. They weren't waiting for me to stay. They were waiting to see what I did after I left. I didn't leave town right away. That surprised me. I expected instinct to take over, to pull me back onto the highway, away from the building, away from the quiet certainty that had settled over everything. Instead, I found myself driving slowly through streets that felt designed to calm. Trees evenly spaced, crosswalks freshly painted, benches positioned where people were meant to rest, not linger. It occurred to me then that environments can be persuasive. They don't force you to behave a certain way. They make some behaviors feel unnecessary. I parked a few blocks away from the facility and turned the engine off. The silence inside the car felt heavier now, as if it had followed me out. I sat there, hands on the steering wheel, replaying the room in my head. The table, the chairs, the water already poured. Comfort is a language. Someone had spoken it fluently. I checked my phone, no new messages. That worried me more than if there had been 10. I opened a notes app and began typing, not because I planned to keep a record, but because I needed to see the words exist somewhere outside my head. I wrote down what the screen had said, the phrasing, the pauses between changes, the way silence had been used as instruction. This interaction is observational. No response is required. You may leave at any time. Each sentence had been technically true, and collectively dishonest. I deleted the note, then reopened it and typed everything again. That indecision told me something important. I was already altering my behavior based on the assumption of observation. That was the point. I drove toward the edge of town, where storefronts gave way to residential streets. Children played in a yard under the loose supervision of an adult scrolling on a phone. A delivery truck idled at a corner. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower started and stopped. Normal life, stitched together seamlessly. I wondered how many systems were hidden inside that normalcy, how many moments of choice were being quietly redirected before anyone noticed. The caretaker's voice echoed in my memory. Observation is not ownership. I knew better now. Ownership doesn't always look like possession. Sometimes it looks like framing. I pulled into a small public park and sat on a bench that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. Across from me, a plaque was mounted to a stone, something commemorative, something designed to be glanced at and forgotten. I didn't read it. I didn't want another curated story. My phone vibrated. Unknown sender. No preamble. Just a sentence. Did you feel uncomfortable? I stared at the screen. That question wasn't about my experience. It was about calibration. I typed a response, then erased it. Typed again, erased again. Finally, I locked the phone and set it face down beside me. Answering would give them tone. Silence would give them duration. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the feeling of discomfort from before all of this began. The vague emptiness. The low-grade unease I'd always attributed to personality or upbringing or the general difficulty of being human. This was different. This was precision. My phone vibrated again. Your hesitation is noted. I exhaled slowly, steadying my breath. They didn't need my words. They needed my timing. I stood and walked toward the edge of the park, where a narrow path led into a small wooded area. It wasn't remote. It wasn't wild. Just enough trees to create the illusion of privacy. I followed it until the sounds of the street softened behind me. There, I stopped. If they were watching, this would test the limits. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Then my phone buzzed again. You don't need to hide. That sentence hit harder than the others. Hide implies guilt. Hide implies fear. I wasn't hiding. I was thinking. The realization made something click into place. This wasn't an interrogation. It was a behavioral mirror. They weren't asking me questions. They were watching how I answered the absence of them. I remembered the screen in the room. You are an anomaly that remains stable. Stable doesn't mean untouched. It means predictable under stress. I sat on a fallen log and forced myself to stay still, to resist the urge to move just because movement felt like agency, to resist the instinct to do something simply to prove I could. Time stretched, my thoughts slowed, and in that stillness something else surfaced. Anger, not explosive, not dramatic, cold. They had reframed my entire life without my consent, and then had the audacity to call my awareness an opportunity. My phone buzzed again. This time, the message was longer. We understand this is disorienting. What you experienced was not an evaluation. It was an introduction. Introduction to what? To being known? To being measured without pretense? I thought about the children in the basement of the old facility, about the files marked with outcomes that read like administrative afterthoughts, about the ones who hadn't stabilized. I typed one sentence, then stopped, then typed it again. What happens if I don't participate? I stared at the screen, finger hovering. Then I sent it. The response came faster than I expected. Participation is not required. I waited. Another message followed, but outcomes change. That was the truth finally unwrapped. Not a threat, a statement of fact. I felt something settle into my chest. Not fear, not panic, but clarity. They weren't trying to control me. They were trying to predict me. And prediction only works when the subject behaves within expected ranges. I looked up through the trees, watching the leaves shift slightly in the breeze. Light filtered down in fractured patterns, unpredictable and beautiful in a way that no system could fully account for. For the first time since entering town, I smiled. Not because I felt safe, but because I understood the rules well enough to consider breaking them. I picked up my phone again, typed one last sentence. You're observing the wrong variable. The reply didn't come immediately. For once, there was silence. Real silence, the kind that suggests recalculation. I stood, brushed dirt from my hands, and walked back toward the path without rushing. When I reached the street again, the sounds of normal life returned. Cars, voices, distant music. Everything looked the same. But I knew better. The system had introduced itself. And now, It was my turn to decide what kind of subject I would be. I didn't go back to the facility. Not immediately. Leaving the park, I drove without a destination, letting the town recede in the rearview mirror while my thoughts rearranged themselves into something sharper. I understood now that nothing I did inside that building would be interpreted as defiance or obedience on its own. Meaning came from sequence, from timing, from deviation. They weren't asking me to choose sides. They were watching how I navigated the illusion of choice. My phone stayed silent for almost 20 minutes, long enough for hope to flicker, long enough for me to imagine that my last message had landed somewhere human, that it had caused hesitation on the other end. Then the screen lit up. Unknown sender. We don't require your cooperation. The sentence was carefully worded, passive, almost gentle. I waited. Another message followed. We record outcomes. That was the difference. They didn't want permission. They wanted trajectories. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot and shut the engine off. The normality of the place felt almost aggressive. Shopping carts rattling, automatic doors sliding open, a family arguing softly about what to buy for dinner. Life happening loudly enough to drown out the sense of being watched. I sat there, phone in hand, and considered the words they'd chosen. Record outcomes, not impose outcomes, not decide outcomes, just record. That framing was deliberate. It absolved them of responsibility while retaining power. If something went wrong, it wouldn't be because they'd acted. It would be because the data had revealed something. I typed a response, then deleted it. Typed again, deleted again. Finally, I asked the question I'd been circling since the room with the table and the water. What happens if I stop engaging entirely? The answer came slower this time. Long enough for me to notice my own breathing. Long enough for the question to feel heavier after it left me. Engagement is not binary. I frowned. Explain, I typed, then erased it before sending. The system didn't explain. It reframed. Visibility varies. That was the choice they were offering. Not cooperation or resistance. Visibility. You could be highly visible and carefully monitored, or less visible and loosely tracked, but never unseen. The realization tightened something in my chest. This was the lie beneath every option, that opting out was still a form of participation, that refusal simply changed the category you were sorted into. I thought about my father again, about the way he'd burned records and rewritten narratives not to expose the system, but to slip sideways out of its field of view. He hadn't fought it. He'd confused it. That felt important. My phone buzzed again. Your father chose a low visibility outcome. The message made my hands go cold. They'd said his name without saying it. Not his name exactly, but his role. As if he were an entry in a ledger, rather than a person who'd tucked me in at night and taught me how to fix a loose hinge on the door. He disrupted continuity. The next message read, that carried risk. I stared at the words until they blurred. Risk to whom? To him, to me, or to the system? I typed slowly, deliberately. He protected me. The response came almost immediately. Protection is a form of interference. That sentence landed like a verdict. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to before. Love was not an oversight. It was an anomaly. And anomalies were not punished because they were immoral. They were corrected because they introduced uncertainty. I put the phone down and rested my forehead against the steering wheel, breathing in the familiar smell of the car's interior. For a few seconds, I let myself feel the exhaustion underneath the focus, the weight of having every thought treated as data, the strain of knowing that even silence had texture. When I lifted my head, my phone buzzed again. We're not asking you to replace your father. I swallowed. We're asking you not to follow his path. That was the closest thing to a warning I'd received so far. I laughed quietly, the sound surprising me. You already know I will, I said aloud, even though I hadn't typed it. The system didn't respond to that. Instead, a new message appeared, longer than the others. There are 3 visibility states available to you: public continuity, private monitoring, dormant tracking. The words sat on the screen like menu options. Public continuity meant living openly, clean records, predictable interactions at the cost of constant observation. Private monitoring suggested autonomy with periodic correction. Dormant tracking was the most dangerous of all, the illusion of freedom paired with sudden intervention. I realized then that they weren't presenting these options because they expected me to choose. They were watching how I reacted to the existence of categories. Did I seek safety, control, invisibility? I closed my eyes. The system mistook choice for consent. That was its blind spot. I typed one final response. You're assuming I want to stay within your framework. There was a longer pause this time, long enough for a shopping cart to scrape loudly across the pavement, long enough for someone to knock on my window and ask if I was okay. I nodded, smiled, waved them off. Normal interaction, normal behavior. When the reply came, it was the shortest yet. All movement creates signal. That was the truth they'd been avoiding. You couldn't leave the system. You could only decide how loudly you moved inside it. I turned the phone face down and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I felt something settle into place. Not resolve, not confidence, but alignment. The choice they were offering wasn't between visibility states. It was between reacting and initiating. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't waiting for the next message. I was planning my next move. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. That would have been easier to recognize, easier to name, easier to explain to myself as retaliation. But this wasn't punishment in the way stories usually describe it. There were no threats, no warnings, no explicit lines crossed. The consequences arrived as absences. I noticed the first one when I stopped for gas outside of town. I slid my card into the reader, waited for the familiar beep, and instead watched the screen blink twice before resetting. I tried again. Same result. Inside, the clerk took the card and ran it manually. Her smile faded just slightly. "It's not going through," she said. "You might want to call your bank." I nodded, thanked her, stepped aside to let the next customer through. The moment felt unremarkable. That was what made it dangerous. Nothing about it suggested escalation. In the car, I opened my banking app. It logged me out. That alone wasn't unusual. Apps do that sometimes. Updates, security checks, random logouts designed to make you feel protected. I entered my credentials. Invalid. I tried again. Invalid. I reset the password. The app accepted the change, then returned me to the login screen. Invalid again. I sat there longer than necessary, watching the screen, waiting for a message to appear explaining what had happened. None came. I called customer service, navigated the automated prompts, spoke to a person who sounded kind and tired and completely unconcerned with my growing sense of dread. "I'm not seeing an active account under that name," she said. I corrected her. She apologized. "I'm still not seeing it," she repeated. "It may be under a different identifier." Different identifier. I thanked her and ended the call before she could ask more questions. The second absence revealed itself an hour later, when I tried to refill a prescription I'd had for years. The pharmacy system showed no record of it. Not expired, not transferred, just not there. The pharmacist frowned at the screen, then at me. "Are you sure you've filled this here before?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "For years." She typed again, slower this time. "I'm sorry," she said, "I don't see anything." I stepped away before she could suggest solutions, before she could ask for identification, before I had to watch confusion turn into suspicion. By the time I returned to the car, my hands were shaking, not with panic, with recognition. They weren't erasing me, they were re-indexing me, changing the way systems pointed to my existence. I checked my phone. No new messages. That silence was intentional. They wanted me to notice the pattern before explaining it, to feel the shape of the consequence before naming it. The third absence hurt the most. I called my mother, straight to voicemail. I waited a minute and tried again. Voicemail. I checked the time, still early enough that she should have been awake. Not anymore. I sent a text. No delivery confirmation. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. This wasn't collateral damage. This was leverage. I pulled over and turned the engine off, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only solid thing left. The car felt smaller now. The world outside felt curated. Everything ordinary had become suspect. I thought about what the system had said. We record outcomes. This was an outcome. Unknown sender. The phone vibrated in my hand before I could set it down. You're noticing the effects of reduced visibility. The phrasing was almost polite, almost instructional. I didn't reply. Another message followed. This is not punishment. Of course it wasn't. Punishment implies rules you can break. This was calibration. They weren't reacting emotionally. They were adjusting parameters. I typed a response, then erased it. Typed again, erased again. Finally I wrote, "You're interfering with my life." The reply came slower this time, long enough for hope to flicker, long enough for anger to sharpen. "We're preventing escalation." That sentence landed like a weight. Preventing escalation from what? From me telling someone, from me pushing back, from me becoming unpredictable. I remembered the options they presented. Public continuity, private monitoring, dormant tracking. This was private monitoring. Enough access to remind me who controlled the frame, not enough to attract attention. I felt a flash of anger then, clean and bright. "You don't get to decide what's an escalation," I whispered, alone in the car. The system didn't answer that. Instead, a new message appeared. "You can restore stability." Stability. Another word that sounded kind until you listened closely. I stared at the screen, understanding now that this was the consequence of initiating rather than reacting, of stepping outside expected timing, of refusing to choose a visibility state quietly. They weren't punishing me for defiance. They were demonstrating cost. If I wanted normal access to money, to records, to my mother, I would have to move back within predictable parameters. I thought about my father again, about the way he protected me not by fighting, but by absorbing consequences meant for me, by becoming the point of friction so I didn't have to. The realization tightened my chest. This was what he'd been afraid of, not exposure, dependence. My phone buzzed again. "This can stop." I waited. Another message followed. "All we need is cooperation." There it was, not a threat, a transaction. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly, counting the seconds the way I used to when anxiety crept in uninvited. The difference now was that anxiety had an address, a sender, a logic. I opened my eyes, typed one sentence. "You're proving why he was right to hide me." The response didn't come immediately. For the first time since the gas station, I felt something close to satisfaction. The silence stretched. Then finally, one last message appeared. "Resistance increases cost." That was the warning they hadn't wanted to give. I set the phone down gently, like it might break if I moved too quickly. They weren't trying to erase me. They were trying to teach me how expensive visibility could be. And the lesson wasn't over yet. I didn't drive right away. I stayed where I was, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, as if I were waiting for instructions that no longer needed to be spoken. The world outside the windshield continued its careful performance of normality. Cars passed, a truck slowed, then accelerated again. Somewhere nearby, a radio played a song I half recognized and would forget the moment it ended. Nothing looked broken. That was the most unsettling part. I thought about the word they kept using, stability. Stability sounds like safety, until you realize it's defined by whoever benefits from things not changing. Stability isn't about well-being, it's about predictability, about minimizing deviation, about keeping outcomes within acceptable margins. I was no longer within those margins. My phone lay face up on the passenger seat, silent now. I knew better than to believe that silence meant absence. Silence was simply the system's way of letting the consequences finish speaking for it. I checked the time. Only a few hours had passed since I'd entered the building. It felt like days. I turned the key in the ignition and pulled back onto the road, not toward the highway, not toward home, but toward the edge of town where the streetlights thinned and houses grew farther apart. I needed space, not privacy, space, the illusion of distance, even if it meant nothing to whatever was watching. As I drove, memories surfaced without warning, not dramatic ones, not revelations, small things. My father standing in the garage, teaching me how to hold a wrench properly. His voice patient, almost too calm, like he'd learned early on that anger wasted time. My mother folding laundry in silence, her movements precise, efficient, as if leaving room for mistakes made her nervous. I saw those moments differently now. They weren't just parenting styles, they were strategies. They had raised me to be self-contained, to solve problems quietly, to avoid drawing attention when things went wrong. Not because they didn't trust the world, because they did. They knew exactly how it worked. I pulled over on a stretch of road overlooking an empty field. The grass moved gently in the wind, indifferent to systems and observers and visibility states. For a moment, I envied it. I picked up my phone again, no new messages. I opened my notes app and scrolled through what I'd written earlier. Fragments, observations, half-formed conclusions. I added a new line at the top. Resistance increases cost. Not because I believed it, because they wanted me to. That was the trap. The system didn't need to threaten me into compliance. It only needed to make resistance feel expensive enough that I'd internalize its logic on my own. I thought about my mother again, about her phone going straight to voicemail, about the possibility that she was sitting somewhere right now, confused, frustrated, maybe frightened, trying to understand why her son had suddenly become unreachable. Not emotionally, but administratively. They weren't hurting her. They were reminding me that they could. My phone vibrated. Unknown sender. One message. You don't need to carry this alone. The phrasing was almost kind, almost human. That was intentional. They wanted me to imagine relief, to imagine handing responsibility back to something that promised structure. They wanted me to believe that resistance was lonely and cooperation was shared. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Then I typed, "You're wrong." The response came instantly. About what? I felt something shift inside me then. Not fear, not anger. Clarity. About loneliness. I typed. There was a pause, longer than usual, long enough to feel like hesitation, long enough to feel like recalculation. I understood then what my father had done. He hadn't tried to dismantle the system. He'd tried to deny it clean data. He'd inserted noise where clarity was expected, love where detachment was required, ambiguity where certainty was preferred. He'd made me difficult to classify. That was the real resistance, not refusal, unreliability. My phone buzzed again. You're approaching a threshold. I didn't ask which one. I already knew. This was the moment where they would decide whether I remained a controlled variable or became a liability, whether my resistance could be absorbed quietly or needed to be contained more actively. I thought about the options they'd presented earlier: public continuity, private monitoring, dormant tracking, all different shades of the same cage. I typed one final message: if you escalate, you expose yourselves. This time the response didn't come immediately. I waited. The field remained empty. The sky shifted slowly toward evening. A single bird crossed my line of sight and disappeared into the distance. Minutes passed, then my phone vibrated. Exposure is a shared risk. There it was, the admission they'd avoided until now. They couldn't act openly, without consequences, not legal ones, narrative ones. The system thrived in quiet, in plausibility, in the absence of witnesses who understood what they were seeing. I exhaled slowly, letting the truth settle. They were powerful, but they weren't untouchable. Not yet. My phone buzzed one last time. Your father accepted silence. I swallowed. He understood cost. That sentence was meant to end the conversation, to remind me of legacy, of sacrifice, of the price already paid on my behalf. It almost worked. Then I typed the sentence that surprised even me. He accepted silence to protect me. A pause, longer than any before. When the reply came, it was different. Short, uncertain. And now, I looked out at the empty field again, at the road stretching in both directions, at the life I could attempt to return to, diminished and conditional, and at the one opening in front of me, dangerous and undefined. I typed slowly. Now I decide what that protection was for. There was no response after that, no correction, no warning, just silence, real silence, the kind that doesn't feel like observation, the kind that feels like withdrawal. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, knowing that this wasn't an ending. It was a boundary, and boundaries once crossed don't disappear. They reshape everything that comes after.